Power Talk, the Wednesday edition, with me, Knoxman, standing in for the Queen of Hearts, Lerato Mbele, reflecting on white-collar crime and the responsibilities of people in senior positions at an oversight role or at an authority level in the form of a board of directors, both in private and public institutions, and also reflecting on the responsibilities of people in executive positions. So talking about the CEOs, managing directors on a full-time basis together with their management teams. And the reason why we're having this conversation, it's because the level of white-collar crime is just getting out of control. And one was thinking that after the Zondo Commission, what we have heard in the Zondo Commission, we might see a change of mindset, or we might see a decline in a number of people that are involved in this malfeasance. But it seems as if the numbers are just exponentially increasing, which is quite frustrating, because it means that despite what we have heard and seen at the Zondo Commission, and by the way, it was not only as much as the Zondo Commission was to investigate malfeasance, elements of state capture, and what happened in government and public institutions. But it emerged during the Zondo Commission as well that private actors or private companies were very much involved in the project of capturing the state through corrupt means. And even before the Zondo Commission, we've heard about private companies that are colluding to fix prices, people doing all sorts of wrong things just to maximize their profits. And the reason why we're having these conversations today is just to reflect, because sometimes there are checks and balances, there are policies, there are processes, systems that are put in place, both in the public and private sector, to ensure that the risk is mitigated. But my goodness, it seems not to be working at the rate that we want to. I mean, you look at, for instance, King Code of Governance, for instance, from King 1 to King 4. So we will explore all those issues and try to understand what has gone wrong. So let's welcome, joining us on Zoom, it's Dr. T.K. Pooe, Public Policy Specialist at the Wits School of Governance. Dr. Pooe, good morning. Welcome to Power.
Good morning, sir. Thanks for having me.
All right, it's a pleasure. Let's also welcome Professor Parmi Natesan, Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of South Africa. Prof. Natesan, good morning to you. Welcome to Power.
Good morning. Thank you.
Okay. Let's start off with the question of measures that are being put in place. As, for instance, what informed people like Dr. Mervyn King, for instance, Dr. Natesan, to come up with codes like your King Code of Good Governance? There must have been a reason why they did that. Do we know exactly what informed that?
Yes, sure. So in every country we have what we call hard law and soft law. And the hard law is the pieces of legislation that we have, and we have many of those in South Africa. And then the soft law are things like governance codes, etc., which just add to the best practice, governance best practice in any country. It gives us recommendations, principles that should be applied by boards and directors. It helps us, I think, to some extent, and even in our court system, we see it being used when they're determining whether a director acted in the way they should have in fulfilling their duties, etc. The courts often look to a code like King 4 to determine whether that director did the appropriate things. I think you hit the challenge, the nail on the head in terms of the challenge earlier when you spoke about how many processes, documents, structures, etc. there already are in all these organizations. Now you add to that, there's a King Code of Governance. You add to that the thousands of pieces of legislation we have in this country. But ultimately, we need human beings to give to each of those things. Those things can't stand on their own, and that's where I think we sit with the problem oftentimes, is that humans who are living these codes and rules and laws aren't always doing the right thing. And when they either deliberately or ignorantly, I'm not sure which one it is, it's often different in different cases, are they being held sufficiently accountable? One of the things we often ask is, are there sufficient consequences to deter people from doing the same thing going forward? So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell where I see the problem lying.
Yes. Dr. Pooe, I want us to interrogate the statements that we normally hear. Firstly, we are talking about having the best constitution in the world. That's the statement that we hear mostly. We hear that we have good policies and legislation. We hear those things. We've got systems of checks and balances. Have we interrogated these things enough? If these statements are true, that we have all these things in place, why is it that there is so much levels of corruption in the public sector?
It's a brilliant one, because I remember giving the same answer to Parliament, where I said that, look, it's actually a bit of a false hearing where we say, look, best constitution. Well, look, I'm a football team, and I love football. My favorite team is Kaiser Chiefs, but there's no objective measure which can tell me that Kaiser Chiefs is good. The only thing we have to use is what have you won and where are you in the league. So it's very hard to say the same thing about the South African Constitution. So sometimes I think that gets raised only because people really don't want to get to the nub of the issue, which is to say, look, there's an economist, Thomas Sowell, he actually puts it well, says, look, it's about incentives, not intention. And a lot of what you read about the South African Constitution is a lot of good intention, which I think, as the good professor said, is sometimes followed up by legislation, but we've yet to answer the key question to say, what drives human intention? Why is it that when human beings who are put on boards or in positions of authority who actually earn very well, I think that's the other thing we kind of sometimes have to highlight. What is this incentive for you to say, listen, it's not enough, that you want to do more than that? And I think that's where a lot of the failings in South African legislation and policies about that. We've yet to have that discussion, to be honest, and say, listen, it would seem as though when it really does come to people making decisions, they are routinely, and now we can say, if you choose to believe everything that came from the Zondo Commission, they are routinely making bad decisions. And I think not just bad decisions, willfully making decisions for institutions. And I think we do need to have a rethink about, one, the types of people we put there. This is not so much about you need to have a PhD, you need to have this, you need to have that. It's simply about what's the history of the individual in relation to them making good decisions. And I think until we start having those types of conversation, and again, it will never be 100% because the key variable in this is you're dealing with human beings. But I think we need to come off our high horse a bit about the legislation and really just come to the point and say, how do we get to the point where we can actually be honest to say, using data analytics, saying, where can we see where things work well? Can we copy and replicate that? And let's be humble enough when things do not work to come back and say, listen, it's not working at this moment in time. Where do we go back to change the incentive structure? Because I think until we get there, we're simply going to be having these conversations over and over. And I don't think it helps when we start with the conversation that says we have the best legislation, X and Y, X and Y. It's just that it's not implementable. If it was good, it would have been foreseen what was going to happen.
Yeah. Interesting. Because the question should be about what motivates these people. And Prof. TK is speaking about, we are not talking about people who don't earn, we don't talk about people who earn pittance or peanuts. These people that we're talking about in the majority, they're having very good salaries. So why, on top of that good salaries, they go on to do the things that they do in a corrupt manner? So, Professor Natesan, let's look at this particular one, because I know that you spoke about consequence management and so on. But I think it was in 2014 or so when the Companies Act was augmented, where it started to tighten the roles of board members, members in boards, their fiduciary duties, to go to an extent to say that if you don't perform your duties according to legislation, according to the policies and so on, it's, you are going to be held possibly personally responsible about that. And we've also seen, for instance, one director like Dudumuyeni, for instance, who has since been taken to court and has been declared a delinquent director. So it seems as if in terms of legislation, we've got, mechanisms to deal with this thing. But let me tell you something. There are consequences. People see it, but it continues. And I think it comes back to what Dr. Pooe was asking to say, what motivates the people? So from a private sector side, as you engage with your colleagues, as the Institute of Directors in South Africa, are you picking up reasons why these things is happening, why these things are happening, despite having all these checks and balances?
Cover your first point first before we get on to reasons, and that is a point I made yesterday in the portfolio committee on the amendments to the Companies Act. Is I agree with you that the Companies Act of many years ago made it clear in terms of what duties are, and therefore we should have seen an improvement in how those were carried out.
Professor Parmi, can you turn around a little bit and speak directly into the mouthpiece? We keep losing a bit, and I know it's important what you're going to say. All right, start from the top.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so what I was saying was the Companies Act of a couple of years ago was made it a very important adjustment in terms of making it very clear what a director's legal duty was, and we would have hoped that then it would have been applied better going forward. It also brought into account delinquency, and you mentioned that, and the company's bill that's out now for comment is looking at extending the timeline for which someone can be held accountable and be charged for delinquency, which I think is important. I think the problem that I'm seeing is we don't see far enough delinquency applications going to court as we think we should see. So what we see and hear going on in organizations, one would expect to see more directors being declared delinquent. And you mentioned the one case, but that's the only real case I've seen in a couple of years. I think what's happening is the process or the application process to take a delinquency application to court is extremely long, onerous, costly, and burdensome on an individual to have enough proof to take something to court. So I think companies potentially aren't doing it because of the difficulty and cost and time involved. And therefore, individuals are left to move on to another board and perpetuate the same behavior elsewhere, which is a problem. We often have advocated for requiring some sort of license to practice for directors. I couldn't hear your other guest clearly, but I think what I heard was something around, sort of how we're appointing people and what skills they have and judgment they've made in the past, etc. And I don't think enough is done on the due diligence on directors. So before we appoint someone, do we know what knowledge, skills, experience they have, what their track record is in terms of ethics and doing the right thing in business, making good judgment calls, etc. Where our act, I think, falls short is that it has disqualification criteria for directors. So it says as long as you're not an unrehabilitated insolvent or convicted of fraud, etc., you can serve as a director. I think that bar is far too low. We should be saying, in order to serve as a director, you need to meet these minimum criteria to even be considered, and I think that's also a gap.
Okay. And what will be those minimum criteria, sir?
Look, I think that's debatable, but we have what we call a director competency framework where we actually list a number of technical competencies and social and personal competencies that any director requires. From, on the technical side, understanding a set of financial statements and how to read and interpret it, understanding your role, your legal duties in terms of the Companies Act, those sorts of things. And then the personal and social side, communication skills, reading between the lines, professional skepticism, and those sorts of things, which makes one a good director.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Tikepo, you spoke about the country having to have brutally honest conversations about these issues of accountability. But I'm just asking myself, what kind of conversations can those be? Should it be at a civil society level? Should it be at a parliamentary level? Should it be at an executive level? I'm trying to think that, considering that we have all these pieces of legislation, we've got policies, we've got all these things, but you mentioned something very interesting, that we need to have like a brutally honest conversations about probably the mindset, the attitude, and so on. In your thinking, what will constitute those kind of conversations?
I'd say two things. Understanding that, look, the wheels are in motion. So I know sometimes in academia we get criticized for being idealistic. One, I would think we need to have a discussion around legislation. Sometimes having too much legislation creates its own problem, where it almost becomes like a tick box exercise. For you to meet this, you just say, look, if I get through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I will do it. So I think that's one thing we need to park, to say, listen, we are in the problems we're in. Maybe it's not about adding new legislation. It's about asking what has worked, what has not worked, and almost shrinking it to a level of saying, listen, if it is a checklist, let's actually get the best things that have worked from the various legislation, PMFMA, Companies Act, and the like, and let's actually see what works. So I think that you're able to do while things are in motion. And then secondly, we always need to have I think your kind of guest sort of touched on it, a database of people who've been proven in the private and public sector, who have sat on boards and other institutions, who've actually got a track record, and actually bring them into a room and say, guys, wait, what made you so different in the running of your institution? And how can we almost use that to be the new framework of what we're going to do? So I'm not saying that you stop everything as a country and sit down and have almost like a Zondo commission type of thing. But I think we do need to kind of say, listen, while the wheels are in motion, let's kind of stop trying to. South Africa's bad habit in policy, I always argue, is we want to always keep adding, but we never get to the root cause analysis of what the problem is. So that's how I say that's where we start the conversation. And flowing from these two things, then I think we can be in a position to say, when we now make new legislation and getting behind it, let's actually make sure that it runs across the gambit. Because sometimes this line of delineation between what's good private sector, what's bad in the public sector, which you've made very well, you might find that, look, as a whole, as a country, we really might be a very unethical country. And I know it's not a nice thing to have to say, but I think we might have to be real and say, perhaps as South Africans, we're very unethical across the board. And let's then work towards what is the right incentive structure for a country where it would seem as though there's a high level of unethical behavior. So I think those are the things I would put forward. And it doesn't mean that you stop the country running or you stop it's just simply saying, let's take a pause. Let's take what's happened. Just stop creating more legislation.
Yeah.
Let's see what works. Let's get the people who've done it well, get them to inform what this new overarching new legislation is going to be. And then actually just admit that perhaps as a country, we're very unethical.
Indeed. 27 minutes after the hour 10, the voice of Dr. TK Pooe, the public policy specialist at the Wits School of Governance. He's on Zoom. He's somewhere in Europe. We don't want to disclose. So if you hear a bit of a sounding somehow, he is on Zoom connection. And of course, we are also in conversation with Professor Parmi Natesan, Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Directors in South Africa. We'll be back with you after this.
The station for news and talk. Power 98.7 on 103.6 in the south of Johannesburg, 104.4 in the Vaal, and 107.2 in Ekurhuleni. Now we're talking.
Okay, 29 after the hour 10 o'clock. I think because in a very short while we'll be going to the news. Let me see if there are any comments on Twitter pertaining to this so that we can go through them. There's an interesting question that I need to pose to Professor Parmi Natesan pertaining to the Steinhoff case. And Prof. Parmi, I took your comment that we don't see a lot of prosecutions pertaining to delinquency. And it's quite right. I can't think of any other delinquency case except the one of Dudumuyeni. But we've seen very controversial transactions that have actually collapsed companies, including Fidentia, the Steinhoff one. We know that the CEO, Marcus Juste. But what has happened to the board? Why is it all the focus being on Marcus Juste himself? What was the role of the board as the CEO was doing whatever that he was doing? So, Parmi, I'm gonna request you after the after the 10:30 news headlines to give us a perspective on that one, and also your role as the Directors Institute of South Africa, in terms of, supporting corrective measures that need to advance our countries as far as these issues are concerned. All right. Nyaka Lotefu standing by with the 10:30 news headlines.
Power Talk on Power 98.7.
We continue reflecting on the escalating white-collar crime and responsibilities of people who are serving in different boards. And by the way, it is not only just the board, because, there are board subcommittees, and this subcommittees like audit and risk subcommittee, governance committees and all these kind of things. But still, somehow, somewhere, the corruption happens. Just like this massive corruption scandal of Steinhoff. So, Professor Natesan, the Steinhoff issue. And I'm also curious, especially based on the comment you made earlier, to say we see less prosecutions of delinquency cases or less reporting of these cases to the law enforcement agencies. What needs to be done? But firstly, your comment on the Steinhoff, and why is the focus only on Marcus Jooste and not the board of directors?
So, I think it's a difficult question, and I've noticed a trend with a lot of these sort of governance failures or corporate collapses, whatever you want to call them, that it seems to me, and this is a layman's perspective because I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me like in our legal and justice system, it's easier to have enough proof to bring action against an executive who was there on a daily basis, who was doing the deal, signing the contract, probably the key man or key woman in the actual wrongdoing, versus having sufficient evidence to bring action against the board members, because the board members are relying on information they've been given, and whilst they need to interrogate that information, obviously, and ask the right questions and apply professional skepticism with what's put in front of them, they're also relying on other parties. They're relying on not only management, but functions within the company, like the risk function, compliance, etc. They're relying on internal audit functions who should be reporting findings or lack of following process, etc. They're relying on external audit to eventually give their professional opinion on the set of financials that it fairly reflects the financial affairs of the organization. And whilst it's difficult to say because we weren't there, and it's hard to tell exactly where things went wrong. It's difficult to believe that all of these legs almost had a part to play in causing or not picking up these issues. So that's on the Steinhoff issue. Then but
Parmi, before you move to the next one, isn't that the problem though? And especially from you being the Institute of Directors, isn't that the problem though, that we know we might not have intimate knowledge of what happened within Steinhoff, but we know for the fact that they must have signed off on all these transactions because he can't do them without board resolutions. And secondly, we know for a fact that the board, they've signed, they have committed to uphold the policies, the laws of the company and so on and so forth. They've signed off on that. And they even know that if they don't play their role, their fiduciary duties, they will be held personally responsible because it is there. So that is what I'm saying. You as the Institute of Directors, because we look up for you. That's why when we hear these stories, the first people we think of, it's you, the Director Institute, to say, give us an insight, help the nation understand that why is it that the focus is on the CEO and not the board as well, considering that they must have signed off to all these transactions?
Yeah. The question is, did they know? And then further than that, because our law is not just what you knew, but ought they to have known that there was wrongdoing in the system? And I guess that's what we're not clear on in terms of whoever needs to now prosecute various people in this case study. Yeah. Your second question, if you can just maybe remind me, please.
No, it's fine. I just want to move across to
Okay,
Dr.
sure.
Paul because of time. I just want to reflect on this, some of the issues from a public sector side. Dr. Paul, as much as I've spoken about the the corporate sector, but in the public sector, we even see government even coming up with what you call the school of government, the school of government that's supposed to deal with issues of ethics and so on and so forth. We've spoken recently to the Commissioner of the Public Service Commission, Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, in terms of the things that are doing to try and reverse this trend of corruption, talking about the type of people they need to bring into the system. So I'm glad that you mentioned that we must be cautious and not spend too much time bombarding laws and regulations and all those kind of things. What must these institutions like the Public Service Commission, as well as the School of Government, that's supposed to inform politicians and the bureaucrats and so on, what things can they do, to reverse the trend of corruption in the public sector?
Well, no, thanks, and that's probably a hard one if we go back to. But you're right to say. Let me start with where I think they're coming right. I do know at the School of Government, Professor Busani Naweni, he is doing a job, and look, he also does lament the fact that until and unfortunately, and this is the case even for Professor Somadoda Fikeni, which is you can have all the intentions, you can have all the workshops you want, but until the incentive structure changes, and by this I mean a simple one, and I think your listeners know this very well. All the whistleblowers that have blown the whistle, it would seem they were punished for doing the right thing. So, that message rings very true across the public sector, because it simply says, when I have the guts, when I follow the right process and due process, I'm the one who gets punished. So that's the first thing I think that must change, because that really just created it was almost a perverse incentive structure, because it says, when you do good, you get punished. So that's the first thing I think that really must change. Because I can speak about, the nice things you could do, the using new data analytics to check how performance is going, where the gaps are. But that's almost like it's a shiny toy in the absence of the institution really saying, listen, I really believe we want to do good. So I think that's probably the first thing I would really stuck on, which is to say, how can we really make it seem and really almost reward people that blow the whistle, right? One of the things they do, I know, within America, is to say all the monies or the proceeds that were gained illegally or in an unethical manner, actually use that to reward people that blow the whistle, right? Because what we do tend to know is once you've blown the whistle, it's either they want to kick you out or some new arrangements gets done where you're the one who's been asked to take a leave of absence, and it starts to impact you professionally. So maybe if we started to say, listen, let's actually reward, even financially, those people that come forward so that they don't feel like they have to go back to the institution. And I guess, too, let's actually put security around them, because what we found out about the poor lady who blew the whistle in the Department of Health of Gauteng is that they now come for you. They actually kill you. Yeah. So I think those are the only two things, without putting in shiny toys, that we could do, which is let's change the incentive structure to reward people that are ethical. Because until we do that, we're just bringing new ideas to the table without actually getting to the root cause, which is to say, when people want to do good, they get punished, and that's what government has to change. So that's the only one thing I would say is change the incentive structure to reward people that do good. Because if you don't, anything else we put there is just putting Band-Aid on a bigger problem that we don't want to discuss.
Yeah, indeed. The protection of whistleblowers. I mean, we saw the unfortunate killing of Babita Jokran, a very ethical public servant who blew the whistle on the massive corruption that is taking place at the Tembisa Hospital. But we're grateful that the suspects have been arrested, and I just hope that the mastermind, because it is, it's well and good to get the people who have pulled the trigger, but at the end of the day, the National Prosecuting Authority has to present, and the Hawks have to present the masterminds, the people who ordered the hit. So that is extremely, extremely important. Professor Natesan, on Kim 4, Code of Corporate Governance, one element that was spoken highly of was the element of stakeholder consultation and stakeholder management. So I'm just curious in terms of the in terms of your Institute of Directors of South Africa, in terms of that part, when you engage your stakeholders, particularly on this issue, which is quite a worrying issue based on what we saw at the Zondo Commission and stories that are and stories that are happening in the private sector of collusions and corruption and so on and so forth. What are your stakeholders saying about this? Because, like I'm saying, in King 4, they speak highly of the importance of stakeholder engagement, including communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a voluntary membership body, obviously our key stakeholder is our 9,000 members of the Institute, many of them who are designated. And I think they have a similar view to us in that not enough is being done to hold people accountable. Not enough has been done when people are appointed in terms of vetting their skills and doing proper due diligences, etc., to ensure that they, there for the right purpose to serve the entity and that sort of thing. Wider than that, we also engage as far as we can with speaking out for ethical and effective leadership, speaking out via media, speaking out directly to Zondo. In fact, we wrote a letter to Zondo before he made his final recommendations, just on governance and directorship elements that we picked up that we felt needed attention. As I mentioned yesterday, we were presenting to the Portfolio Committee for the Department of Trade and Industry on the company's amendment bill, and our main two base there was one around director skills and minimum competencies and how we're vetting directors, or who's allowed to be appointed as directors, and especially on our listed and SOEs where the impact is so large. And the second was on accountability and delinquency. We often raise the point that directorship is one of the few professions where there's no actual license to operate. So you go, you want a chartered accountant, they have to be a member of SAICA. You want a lawyer, they have to be either medical association or health professions council or whatever it is that regulates them and their conduct as well. And unfortunately, directorship doesn't have such a license to practice. So anyone can be appointed anywhere. There's no code of conduct that's underpinning how they can behave. There's no ability to remove their license to operate if they infringe that code of conduct.
This is very interesting. So is that something that you are recommending, to say that, there has to be a professional body that the directors are registered to so that they can be held accountable? Because you're quite right that, they are not hold to a certain standard, particularly by that particular body. And maybe it might even increase, it might somehow address your concern that there are less delinquency cases that are taken up. But if there is a professional body, it might be different. Is that something that you're proposing?
That's exactly the point we were trying to make yesterday to the parliamentary committee. We know that there aren't enough delinquency cases because of the time, effort, cost involved. But other professions, if you think about professions like a doctor or even a builder for that matter, when you're appointing or going to a doctor or a builder, you want to make sure that they are registered, that they have the proper designation, skills and experience has been vetted. You want to make sure that they keep their skills up to date via continuous professional development. You want to make sure there's a code of conduct under which they're practicing so that they can be held accountable. And all of this, I feel, is very critical for directors as well, but doesn't exist at this point in time.
Fantastic. I think we will get in touch with the Department of Trade and Industry and Competitions to say what are they thinking about the proposal you're making. I think it will go a long way in terms of that. Let's take a quick break. When we return, I'm going to ask Dr. Pooe very quickly to reflect on the state institutions that work effectively because a new sheriff is in town. Let's talk about the two administrations, the Zuma administration and the Ramaphosa administration, using one example of the SIU. Why is that? Why don't we just see consistency? Whether it's a Zuma administration, a Ramaphosa administration, the SIU, the Hawks, the NPA, and all institutions, they must work effectively in the service of South Africans.
Getting you what you need to know. Power Talk, weekdays 9 a.m. to noon on Power 98.7.
Kefenzo in Johannesburg, I'll be coming to you shortly. Dr. Pooe, the question that I posed, why does it matter when the administration changes? Even in municipalities, DA-led municipality changes and the ANC, but why does it, I mean, you will bet that the SIU never existed. But look at look at the fantastic work that they're doing, and maybe with an addition, obviously, of the special tribunal, where they're taking this civil litigation straight to the special court called the special tribunal. But the bigger question: why don't we see this consistency under different administrations led by people from the same party, for instance?
No, in a quick answer, I kind of summarize it to four follows. If I had to kind of summarize the former administration of President Jacob Zuma, was basically the conspiracy of politics, which was to say how he came in terms of the points he raised about the Scorpions and how he created a whole conspiracy where even, South Africans were like, this guy has a point. But we never then were able to say, but listen, where does your point end so that it doesn't harm the good work that the institutions were doing? And then you have what I term the conspiracy of inefficiency, which is President Ramaphosa administration when it comes to the SIU and also the MPA, which is, it's a lot of fanfare, but nothing really is being done in terms of, you spoke about Ms. Dudi Mieni, but we've not seen people who, we saw the Zondo Commission, we heard a lot of things about the Zondo Commission, but have you and I actually seen any of the big wigs actually go to jail? So that's what I term the conspiracy of inefficiency, which is to say, eventually, when you create a conspiracy of politics where you start to run down institutions and people start to leave, you get a new administration who come with fanfare, but I think they refuse to be honest in saying that you simply don't just wave a wand and things get right. If anything, you actually need a strategy which says, listen, in the short term, this is what we aim to do. And I don't quite feel as though our institutions, MPA and SIU even, are actually doing that, which is to say, look, pick things that are called low-hanging fruit so that we can actually test the skills of whether you're actually getting to the rub of the green. Never mind going for the big people in the short term. Get your institution to have the right people and the right skills to know the court processes. Because what you're seeing a lot with, especially with the MPA, they're losing cases not because the cases don't have merit, but because even the judges say this is sloppy work. You've not presented this in the right way. And I think that's what sometimes makes it so hard for these institutions to do their work. Even though it's one political party, it's people who've known each other for who knows how many donkey years. There is just that inefficiency to be able to have a plan to tackle this problem. And what they then do is, rather than being honest and saying, guys, we've messed up, and this is a true state of things, you have a commissions of inquiry, which I'm not a fan of commissions of inquiry, because at the end of the day, they carry no legal weight. It's, yes, Judge Zondo himself has put out his stuff, but what has happened post that? It's going to take donkey years for that to be done. I think we just need to, as I said, stop with the charade, stop with coming up with all these things, and simply just get to the point to say, this is where we're failing. Let's put our resources together. The private sector has come on board with them saying, listen, we're more than happy to put money together and give you the necessary skills in law enforcement to really make these things happen. I think we just need to say in the medium term, let's pick things which have really hit the country. Let's get our best and brightest minds, actuaries, data scientists, to actually push these people into the court, one, win the cases, and then retrospectively walk it back to the point of where we can say, listen, South Africans start to say, listen, it really does pay not to be bad. But unfortunately, at the moment, what's incentive if you work at local government, when you see the mayor, when you see the council doing bad, what's incentive for you to also say, listen, let me not also take a bit of the milk? And until we get there, unfortunately, it's not a good thing. And we can have all the shows, you can have all the commissions of inquiry you want, but unfortunately, that's what we're stuck in, that we're not seeing people be punished for doing bad.
Okay, Gefenza, Johannesburg, good morning, welcome.
Peace be unto you, Morio, and your guests as well as listeners. Thank you so much for this insightful conversation.
Peace be unto you, sir.
Thank you very much. I just want to touch on two quick points. One, I think, to reiterate what Dr. Pooe raised when he spoke about, have we done an assessment of the kind of society we live in to assess whether it's ethical or unethical, and how do we respond to that? And my point there is just to enforce the law is not enough, but we need to also effort ourselves to building a culture that would, counteract this unethical behaviors that we see. Because you can enforce the law, but if the psyche or the psychology of the people is not changed, then you'll still have the same problem going on and on. Because we often talk about corruption, and I know that today we're focusing on executives both in business and government, but we often talk about it as this big thing when actually it starts with you and I, Mario, who stopped on the side of the road, and we know that we don't have the correct particulars with us, and instead of accepting the accountability measure that is put there in the form of a ticket, would rather take out the 50 rand in the form of a cold drink in order to, get away with that. So how do we change the psychology of the people across all sectors of society to understand that it is bad to be corrupt, it is bad to be unethical, so that we can build a new culture? But the last point I wanted to touch on is, I think another thing that we need to really take into consideration is the fact that there is no sustainability in terms of executive and succession. I mean, you look at ESCOM, how many boards have we had in the last 10 years?
Yeah.
And it's not just ESCOM. There are certain departments, there are other state-owned enterprises where executives are being chopped and changed willy-nilly. And you ask yourself about a lot of things, processes that get lost in translation in all of those chopping and changing. Right?
Yeah.
So how do we begin to build a system that will ensure long-term sustainability in terms of people that are actually deployed in boards, are deployed in executive positions, just so to ensure that there is continuity, but also there is the question of succession planning.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have succession planning, you can't deal with this thing, because a lot of things will get lost in translation. And
exactly.
even accountability measures cannot be put in place when there is no long-term sustainability in terms of the people that are deployed in those positions.
Great points, Kefense. We got to leave it at that because we're about to reach the news. But great points indeed. And that one was also canvassed with the Public Service Commission in terms of people changing ministries, and then the new minister bring the whole department and all those kind of things. It was raised with the Public Service Commission. All right, we've got only a minute each to wrap it up. Professor Natesan, I give you a free hit. Give me your final closing comments for a minute.
Look, I think what's clear is that we need better consequence management. We need better accountability for directors. That can come in various forms, whether it be more companies taking applications for delinquency, or whether we push to professionalize directorship as a profession in its own right and have a license to practice so that people can be held accountable and their license can be removed if they transgress what the expectations are.
Dr. Pooe, your final hit?
It's not about good intentions. It's about changing the incentive structure. That's one. Two, not about having more legislation. It's about having a real conversation, putting in place, finding out what has worked, and making sure that that feeds into the overarching infrastructure that we are supposed to have.
Thank you both for your great insights. Professor Parmi Natesan is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Directors in South Africa, and Dr. T.K. Pooe, Public Policy Specialist at the Wits School of Governance.